Welcome to today's webinar. It is presented by me, Professor Andy Lane, from the University of Wolverhampton, and the title is I Want to Perform Better, so how should I feel and what should I do? The webinars are being run by the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences in conjunction with the book company Human Kinetics. It's going to last about an hour. And what I'm doing here is having a practice go. I'm going to record this as an audio file and let people listen to it who will give me some feedback on what it'll be like when I do it live next week. So if you have any questions, you can send them over to me, give me a bit of practice. Here's some background on myself. I am a professor of sports psychology since 2005. I published around about 125 peer-refereed articles. I used to count religiously. I remember getting to over 100, having a conversation with someone who said, "Have you put your bat up yet?" And I started counting and realised that I had put my bat up about a month earlier and forgot to celebrate, which was a shame. The most recent work is really exciting, done in conjunction with the BBC, called Can You Compete? And it was developed with Michael Johnson, the former Olympic athlete, and it's a really exciting piece of work which we'll be touching on some of the results today in the presentation, although we're still analysing that, and so therefore we can't really let the key findings come out just before we've published. The work you're going to be hearing about and reading about comes from a big project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council called Emotion Regulation of Others and Self, very cleverly named EROS. I'm not one for acronyms, but that's a fantastic acronym. And this was a fantastic collaborative research project. Fantastic in a sense that the people on the left, Peter Totterdell, Warren Mansell, Brian Parkinson, David Holman, Pascal Fearon, Tom Webb, Tom Farrow, and Pascal Sheeran, are all outstanding academics. Not only are they outstanding academics, they're a joy to work with. And over the last 5 years, we've had some really engaging discussions on emotion and emotion regulation and some really enjoyable time. So it's been a really worthwhile topic. Obviously, my area of sports psychology has meant that that's been the focus. But I'd really, of all my work, what I would really encourage people to do is follow similar lines, a similar model to this, and go and work with the clinical developmental neuroscience. In other words, other areas of psychology or multidisciplinary projects where you get really different perspectives on what might be similar topics. It's been very rewarding. So what did EROS achieve? 80 journal papers published, 2 books, 21 chapters in edited books, 94 conference papers, a whole load of broadcasts and coverage in national newspapers, including professional magazines, a BASES expert statement on emotion regulation and one on music, advice to the Research Council's UK report to the House of Lords Selects Committee, and a whole load of website usage. The aims of my talk are to identify emotions associated with best and worst performance. If I want to perform better, then how should I feel? The second is to examine strategies that people would use to change their emotions, to try and answer the question, if I want to feel better, how do I do it? And thirdly, to examine how someone might go around to change someone else's emotions. If I want you to perform better, how do I change your emotions? Let's begin by looking at the evidence, and we will start with anecdotal evidence. Why? Because there's lots and lots and lots of it. You don't need to search too hard to find quotes from athletes who have not performed as best as they'd liked and attribute the poor performance to an inability to control their emotions. In this case, it's talking about our own performance. So there's Usain Bolt blaming anxiety. Here we've got athletes trying to intimidate the opposition. Here we've got sports people trying to intimidate the officials. And here we've got a lovely example of someone losing emotional control, kicking a chair
although it wasn't the chair, it was someone's leg, and that leads to the player being disqualified. And so, on the basis of that brief perusal of the anecdotal evidence, we could be persuaded, or possibly persuaded, that emotions are key. Certainly, if we took the view that emotions influence performance and then looked for anecdotal evidence, we would see lots and lots of it. And I alluded to that previously, but we will, and it's because emotions are fairly powerful things, and athletes experience these emotions intensely prior to and during competition. And so we might be persuaded to believe that seeking strategies to regulate our emotions to a certain emotional state, whether that be to feel happy or to feel excited, might be the best way to go. But before we do so, let's look at the evidence. Because we want evidence that says if we change this variable, whether that's trying to make someone happier, then that is going to lead to them improving their performance. It's going to make a change in what they do, and that change be better than it was previously. And we need the evidence to be really persuasive, to be one which is not about bias of researchers, which is not one about memory of that I performed really well and felt really happy when I was performing really well, but one that is solid, is rigorous, and one where the researchers have really got to grips with the key question, trying to control for as many of the variables that might influence their results. So we don't want to have a false belief that emotions influence performance if that's not the case. Let us begin with looking at the evidence. Firstly, what are emotions? And this seems an obvious one. Look across all those pictures, we can see lots and lots and lots of emotional states, and we can identify most of them. Angry, yep, we've all experienced anger. Worry, yes, of course, right the way through to anxious and scared and so on. It should be no problem in trying to define emotions. Unfortunately, that is not the case, and what we have here is a quote from Brian Parkinson's chapter in the fabulous Eros book, Should I Strap a Battery to My Head?, available at Amazon, that everyone knows what an emotion is until asked to give a definition. And that quote from Fair and Russell in 1984 still holds true today, and is testimony of the difficulty academics have had in trying to find a commonly agreed definition of emotion. What we know from Brian Parkinson's work is that emotion is about something. We don't just get angry, we get angry about something. Emotions feel good or bad in some way, they're not neutral states. And thirdly, emotions change over time. There are people who are angrier for more often than others, but generally we have intense emotions for certain periods, and then they change. In intensity accordingly. We get nervous before doing something important, and those nerves are over when we're at the post-event celebration or wake, depending on the outcome. But we know that emotions change. If we delve a little deeper, and let's try to find a starting point to research on emotions, some really nice work from the evolutionary perspective, and Baumeister, who will feature quite a bit in this presentation, came up with this lovely quote: if the total net effect of emotion were to cause behaviours that were maladaptive, such as reducing survival and reproduction, then natural selections would have phased out emotion from the human psyche. The idea is that emotions are functional, and from this statement we might start going, well, that's fairly true. What about some emotions help people deliver best performance? This isn't what Baumeister's saying. He's saying all emotions have a function. Let's look at some of those emotions now. Firstly, let's look at the unpleasant ones, because these unpleasant ones are typically ones which we tend to see as the ones we should try to control, to regulate downwards, reduce the intensity. Anger and anxiety. Both are associated with high action tendencies. We get a strong physiological response when we're feeling angry and when we're feeling anxious, and that promotes either withdrawal or approach behaviours, and there's a real evolutionary basis for that, in that getting angry with someone might get you ready to fight, the fight or flight response, and that helps you be immediately prepared for that sort of physical activity, either fight an opponent over for a woman you're planning to have a relationship, the idea to reproduce, or to fight someone for some food that you're going to kill. We're going back to evolutionary perspectives. In the same way, anxiety might prompt you to run away from certain situations where where your life is threatened. Depression has a low action tendency. It signals conserving resources or withdrawing from an activity, which might be very functional in certain circumstances. Depression can have a social function. When someone feels down, others can try and cheer them up and try to engage in acts of regulations to improve and change their emotions so they're happier. So depression might serve a social function, sending a message out to those around you. Interestingly, Chris Beatty, who wrote in the Shall I Strap a Battery to My Head book, the Eros book, a very, very nice chapter, Should I Tackle Emotions or Let Them Pass? And the idea here is that feeling unpleasant emotions can be a really useful thing, a really productive experience, because the unpleasant emotion can be telling you something about the task demands, or telling you something about your own interpretation of that situation, whether that situation is important to you, and you may not be unaware of that. So the idea is that should you tackle those emotions and actually try and challenge the idea that you should try to reduce feeling depressed or reduce feeling anxious, or simply say that these emotions are part of the experience and they will pass in time as the experience passes. And we'll look at how that might unfold accordingly in sport. But it's a really interesting idea, in that the idea, instead of trying to down-regulate unpleasant emotions, you accept them as part of the situation, in the same way that you'd accept feeling very sweaty with hard exercise, that they're part and parcel of something that you're about to be doing. If you accept feeling anxious as part and parcel of taking part in important competition, we shouldn't try to down-regulate the anxiety, but simply accept it as part and parcel of what we're doing. And so this is a typical model of emotions and how they're characterized in a model. And so you've got high activation states such as fear, anxiety, and feeling angry. On the other side, the pleasant ones, surprised, excited, energetic. And then low activation emotions such as feeling relaxed, calm, happy, and the unpleasant ones, feeling disgust, downhearted, sadness. Let's look at some of the evidence now from the literature, from the academic literature on emotion and performance relationships. First point to make is that there have been an enormous amount of research that has been conducted. Over 500 papers have been published that have examined emotions in sport. In terms of some of the methods that they have been used, emotion is typically assessed using some degree of self-report. And here are some examples of measures. There's standardized scales such as the profile of mood states or its derivatives, and there's been shortened versions validated for use in sport, which Peter Terry led and I did as part of my PhD in the 90s. There's the Sport Emotion Questionnaire, which Mark Jones led, and which I helped him. And we did this, and it's an interesting journey which Mark and I went on, and it was done in response to the other journey I went on with Peter, in as much that the criticism of the Brunel mood scale, which we had 2,000 or so people had completed, and we did an enormous amount of validation work on it, was that it was really negative, and also the idea that it was maybe mood and emotion are slightly different. Once we've got the Sport Emotion Questionnaire and then validate it and look at its relationship with the Brunel scale which we developed, they're very, very similar. In fact, you can, I think, and I would say that I think you can use one or the other, and I think they're equally valid, and that might be a bit of fence sitting as I try to make good my own work, but there are a lot of similarities between the two. The starting point for the Sport Emotion Questionnaire is that we asked athletes the starting point for the Brunel mood scale is that we use the model that was developed in the profile of mood states. And so there's a much nicer, from a sport psychology perspective, starting point for the sport emotion questionnaire, but it's not hugely different from the Brunel mood scale, and it's not something to get really defensive or aggressive about in terms of trying to claim one is has greater validity over the other. And what you can see from this presentation, these slides, is that there's some hyperlinks, and the hyperlinks will take you to resources. So they'll take you to Mark Jones's web pages, which will be able to access the articles. It will take you to the Brunel mood scale online, which allows you to complete it and see what that looks like. And so there's just useful resources. A commonly used measure of anxiety, the competitive state anxiety inventory 2, used in a massive research and produces some really interesting and insightful findings, which we will look at slightly later, which really opened up the idea that people can feel in a fairly nervous or anxious, intense emotional state as the research expanded, but feel unpleasant emotions to some with a greater degree of intensity, but not say that these experiences are very negative towards performance. And I know that in some of my other work I've been somewhat critical of this, and certainly this discussion here isn't the point to start getting into that, and that's more academics chewing over the meaning of one word and how it might be interpreted differently, and that's around concerned v worried, for if anyone's interested. The individualized approach, which Yuri Hanin does, and does very, very well, it takes the approach that the athlete has a unique set of emotions, a unique set of personal experiences, and a unique set of words that they use to describe those emotions, and the best way to assess that is to develop an individualized scale. No one, I don't think, would disagree with the importance of individual differences within research and the idea that people are different. However, and what we have from this approach is really interesting and insightful evidence which shows that unpleasant emotional states are not always bad for performance, pleasant emotional states are not always good for performance, and it really unpacks it from the perspective of the athlete, and we'll look at some of that later too. This is the typical way of assessing emotions. It's to have a single word on the side, and that is common for the sport emotion questionnaire, common for the Brunel mood scale, common for Yuri Hanin's work also. And you have on the top some degree of where you rate it from not at all to extremely, and the greater the intensity, the higher the score, and that's fairly common across approaches. The early findings produced this idea of an iceberg profile, the idea that successful performance is all about feeling above average vigour, coupled with below average tension, depression, anger, fatigue and confusion. The iceberg profile, 1980s. And the 1980s, for some of you listening to this, will seem like a lifetime away. For me, as an undergraduate, this was within the same decade I started. This was exciting work that had not been refuted. This was the test of champions, this was portrayed as, and it was really excited and contemporary work, and it might look dated now, but that the idea that successful athletes demonstrated an iceberg profile was very much something that was in the contemporary literature when I started doing research in this area. So that was the model of emotion regulation, the idea to increase the pleasant ones, decrease the unpleasant ones. That's what practitioners would take from that evidence. Then we get on to some of the tests of the iceberg profile, and the idea that does this hold up when we look at it in other studies. And we get some evidence for the idea that feeling vigour, the pleasant emotion, associates with successful performance. So the idea that increasing vigour might be useful is somewhat supported, only somewhat, not completely. The idea that confusion and depression associate with poor performance, so also the idea that reducing these emotions might be something useful. From the meta-analysis of Chris Beattie, we get a really nice switching effect for anger and tension, in that the switching effect is that anger and tension are sometimes associated with good performance in some studies. In other words, the more angry you are, the better your performance. But in other studies, they're associated with poor performance. As you get angrier, your performance declines. As you get anxious, your performance declines. And here is an example of two winning athletes from 1992. So this is again quite a long time ago. And what we have is athlete A in red is experiencing what some might describe as an iceberg profile, high vigour, coupled with the low unpleasant ones, and therefore the emotion regulation push for that athlete might be to try and increase vigour. Athlete B, by contrast, is feeling quite a bit tense, little, not so vigorous, and what this illustrates is the different emotional profiles that are associated with winning performance. And we get this really, really clearly in Hannin's work. And we have one of Yuri Hannin's slides from a previous presentation that in a symposium that he did. And what we have, and I've just highlighted the harmful and helpful high activation, unpleasant ones, so afraid and tense, and one afraid being supposedly harmful and tense being helpful, just to illustrate the fact that these unpleasant high activation states appear in both lists. And in the same case for supposedly pleasant emotions, energetic is supposedly helpful and excited is supposedly unhelpful. And you'd really need to get to grips with what someone's thinking and feeling in order to understand that this was the case, because the model we talked about previously would tend to suggest that feeling excited is something that someone should want to feel, and that should be associated with good performance. This athlete, it says something different. And then we get to continue with the notion that unpleasant emotions are sometimes associated with good performance. A lovely quote from which summarises Sheldon Hanton, Steve Mellieu's team down in Wales, that done an enormous amount of research that has demonstrated really clearly that this state, many athletes maintain high levels of performance when they report feeling intense anxiety and see that anxiety as helpful of performance. And they've done it in different methods. So the idea that it's not a product of the questionnaire, because they've used there have been questionnaire-based studies, but not always the same questionnaire. They use open-ended interviews, so that these concepts have emerged in qualitative, tell us what happened type studies, and also intervention studies, where the idea is that changing emotions to improve performance has followed this model of identifying what emotions associate with best performance, and the interpretation of those emotions, and following that approach to change the interpretation of unpleasant emotions, and that's what's been found to lead to improved performance. So we get an instrumental model of emotion regulation, where that high activation, it might be about increasing the intensity of high activation emotions such as anger, fear, anxiety, and lowering some of the low activation unpleasantness, disgust, downhearted, and sadness. So let's look at some of our studies. Firstly, there's been some issues with data collection. It's been a really difficult job, and with all this money from the ESRC, and you think that the participants would be falling over themselves to get involved in your study, and this wasn't the case. In the early days of setting the project up, we went to an enormous amount of effort to try and get people to take part in our studies, and we recruited research assistants to phone people up and try to get people involved, and it was really, really difficult. So our approach then switched to try and work with end users of research, to people who could help us embed the findings in practice. So we did some really nice work with Runners World, and we'll be talking about that shortly, where they helped distribute a questionnaire, and we got over 1,100 people taking part. I promoted a lot of my work on the London Marathon website, which has applied techniques and tips to help people control their emotions during marathon performance. You can see the connection immediately between Runners World and the marathon in terms of an outcome. And more recently, our fantastic project with the BBC, Can You Compete Under Pressure, which is such a privilege to be involved with, which tests the effects of interventions designed to change emotions to improve performance. And luckily, you're going to hear some of the results of that today. Only some of them, I'm afraid, but it's been a fabulous project to be involved with in terms of the professionalism of the BBC and just what can be done online and how resources can be constructed to provide people with really meaningful feedback on how they performed and what emotions they experienced and how they can interpret those emotions in the future. And there's the link. You can still get on it and see all the resources. And there's just a few clips for you. He's showing off. So one of our studies, how do people want to feel and what strategies do people use to achieve this state? And this was published in the Scandinavian Journal of Medicine, Science and Sport and was a collaborative effort with Chris Beattie, Tracy Devonport and Damien Stanley. And we're really looking at the idea of finding out how many runners wanted to increase anxiety and anger in order to help performance, and the idea that from a sample of people, just how many would express a desire to increase these emotions, actually intentionally try and make themselves angrier. And what we found, we got 15% of people who did try to change their emotions in that direction, and the vast majority did not, and that might make sense, that the idea that they would want to feel less angry, that makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, and their numbers endorse that. Let's look at the average scores in terms of how angry and how anxious they were feeling and what they did. So what we've got in the reducing anxiety group is that yes, they are a little bit lower in anger and a little bit lower in anxiety, but at the same time they are using very similar degrees of similar amounts or engage in a similar number of strategies to try and increase their pleasant emotion. So the idea that someone's feeling angry and anxious but they're not engaging in strategies to try and make themselves feel more pleasant doesn't necessarily occur. Equally, there is not a huge difference in the strategies that people are using.
One of our projects we're running at the moment is run in conjunction with the BBC. It's fronted by Olympian Michael Johnson. What the project involves is completing a number of questionnaires, then performing in a number of tests. At the end of it, you get a report on your psychological strengths and weaknesses and how well you've done in the test. What Michael does, he talks you through how you can improve your mental game.
So one of the benefits of doing the project with the BBC is the fact that getting the data collected was made a bit easier by some of the commercial activities and mass media activities that were going on. Now, it's quite nice to have your project launched on the One Show with Ricky Gervais, and which is just what happened. It was really quite a nervous event for the certainly meant for me in terms of what was going on, because the idea Ricky Gervais could be somewhat of a loose cannon to a project which is meant to be looking at psychological skills and emotions in sports performance. However, Michael Johnson chaperoned him perfectly to keep him relatively serious during the show. On the day, on May the 1st, 2012, I did a whole number of radio interviews to help promote the study, and we got over 30,000 people complete the project on the first day, which is really, really comforting. So let's look at some of those findings from the study, and let's look at the emotions that people reported associated with best and worst performance from that study. And we asked them, when you performed at your best, how did you feel? Very simple, very, very much in the same style of research of which Yuri Hanin has done in his work of optimal and dysfunctional emotional states associated with performance. Then what do we have? We have what looks like a big difference in happiness. Best performance is certainly feeling happy. Not much of a difference in anxiety. Big difference in feeling dejected. Bigger difference in feeling energetic, and a really smaller difference in feeling fatigued. Feeling that anger is not very good for performance, and feeling that excited would be fairly good for performance. So what we did then, we'll look at the number of the differences between best and worst performance in terms of emotions. Was there a clear difference between when someone felt happy, when they felt their best performance against their worst performance? So we simply calculated the difference between best and worst performance for each emotion. So what we've got is that people feel 90% of people feel that they are over 2 units happier in best performance than worst performance. So there's a big difference. There's a great big gap between them. Same for energetic. Same for anger. Same for dejection, only going the other way. For anxiety, the difference between best and worst performance in terms of how intense that experience is relatively small. So very high anxiety tends to be associated with poor performance. Moderate anxiety tends to be associated with best performance. And getting that gap between best and worst right in terms of the intensity of the emotion will clearly be a difficult thing to do.
Okay, Chris, we've got your data from best and worst performance, and looking at the anxiety scores, it's not a lot of difference between best and worst performance. You're quite anxious before your best and just a little bit higher in anxiety before your worst. Can you sort of give us a bit more detail as to what's going on between those two performances?
Yes, a lot. So I'm aware of the bodily changes that are going on, that my heart rate might be a bit higher, but normally the negative performance is associated with their negative thoughts rather than actually the sensations.
The thing is about emotions that they can be very intense irrespective of your level of competition. I know lots of people who take part in what might be fun runs feel awfully nervous before taking part and are really uncertain about how to go about changing these emotions or trying to learn to reinterpret them. So it's not only about trying to have strategies available, but also have the confidence to use them at the critical times.
So how should I feel? Firstly, you should try to identify the emotional states associated with your best and your worst performance. Develop your own emotion performance profile, because they are the emotional states you want to feel. The second is try to identify why you're feeling that way. You're feeling anxious because the event is very important to you. If that's the case, that's normal. That's possibly how you or it's possibly how you should feel. But really give it some thought as to why you are experiencing those emotions. What are the underlying thoughts and beliefs that are leading you to feel those emotions in that way? And we'll look more at the strategies that people use over the course of the next few slides. So when we look at emotion regulation strategies, and when we started doing research in this area, I rather expected to find an emotion regulation strategy that worked and be able to just apply this across different areas of investigation. Go, oh, this works here and not so well here, and so on and so forth. And so the idea that there are 400 different ones throws the spanner in the works somewhat, because there's almost everything and anything can be an emotion regulation strategy. And when you look at what the strategies are, things like exercising, listening to music, talking to people, you find that there's lots and lots of different things that are routinely done that you might not think of as emotion regulation strategies. But when pushed, this is exactly how people do change their emotions. The idea that people might go for a walk to calm down makes total sense. The idea that you adopt this behavioural strategy, as it's being classified there, in order to try and change your emotional state. We know that most sports psychology interventions have an effect on emotions. The idea that self-talk leads to improved performance, but it also leads to feeling better about your performance, about feeling more confident that you're going to perform very well. It can also lead to feeling happier that you're going to perform very well, or using self-talk to talk away the anxiety that you're experiencing, or some of the unwanted thoughts that accompany that anxiety. And the same can be applied for imagery, the idea that you conduct imagery and that creates an image of yourself performing very well, which has a calming effect. All of these things make total sense. So many sports psychology interventions are not called emotion regulation strategies, but they could equally be called those if they're focused in that, or they're put in that context. And so open up your thoughts to the idea that there's an enormous number of different strategies that could be used or called emotion regulation strategies, and not just this small narrow list of things like a magic toolkit that's lurking in the corner that you're suddenly going to find, because I think that's not the way to see these things. And we're going to be looking at one of our studies in a moment that looked at identifying strategies that runners use to regulate their emotions. It's a really nice qualitative study that asked runners to just say how they regulated their emotions, which will give you that applied approach just to illustrate just how many different ways there are to try and change your emotions, and many of these can be effective. What Tom Webb did from the Eros project did this absolutely superb meta-analysis, which took several years to do because of the collecting of all the studies, and which, if anyone's ever done a meta-analysis, will just know how difficult a task that is, because of how it's hard to get hold of the studies, hard to get hold of the data, and the inclusion-exclusion strategy is fraught with difficulties. There's a link to Tom's website which allows you to access a number of his other fabulous studies. What they did is emphasize the effectiveness of reappraisal as an emotion regulation strategy, changing your interpretation of the situation. Reappraise it, see the situation differently. And we'll give an example. For example, an athlete could engage in self-talk to try and strengthen her or his beliefs that he'll perform successfully, and in doing so, the interpretation of the situation as one where it's no longer threatening or as threatening, to one which is being able to achieve success, and as a consequence emotions start changing accordingly. But you are reappraising the situation so that the situation is perceived as differently. They also found that support for reappraising the effectiveness of the emotional experience. So the idea that reappraising anxiety, if anxiety is the emotion of focus, to be interpreted as readiness for competition would be an example of such an approach. And we can see that whilst this has been Webb meta-analysis was done for all areas of psychology, how this just links into some of our work in sports psychology, although it's not labelled or headed under those terms immediately. But we know from our anxiety direction research, a lot of that is about changing the appraisal of the emotional state, which is in terms of this model of Gross's, whose work it starts from, very much what's going. So let's look at our qualitative study to give you a flavour of the sort of things that people do. Led by Damien Stanley, a whole group of us helped and supported on this project. More Runners World data. It's absolutely fabulous when we see how many people took part. And the summary of this finding, very simple summary to start with. Emotion regulation strategies and performance management strategies are very, very closely aligned. The idea that I'd also identify a number of strategies that people use, and people use multiple strategies. So let's look at some, and let's see how many you recognise. So we have things like goal setting, and there is the description. Listening to music, all of us can relate with that, obviously all different types of music. Visualization, physical preparation, the idea of warming up changes how you're feeling. The idea that you have a race or planning strategy, just going through what you need to do. The idea that chatting with people, distracting yourself. The idea of downplaying the outcomes, and we all are guilty of over-egging what this can mean, and certainly in elite competition, Olympic competition, the idea of just reappraising the outcome as something manageable is a really helpful way of overcoming huge amounts of anxieties. The idea that all you're doing is kicking the ball into the goal rather than bringing success home for England under one kick of the ball. I mean, the playing the ball, not the occasion, being the idea there, and that works. It makes a lot of sense to how we approach lots and lots of things in terms of trying to manage our emotions, and over-egging it I think is a really common thing people do, and it's a really simple way it's a simple idea. When you say it, it's not easy to do in practice, of trying to overcome those really horrible, unpleasant, unwanted emotions that can creep in. I'm not talking about personal experiences here. This is not a counselling session for me. Active enjoyment, the idea of trying to tell yourself this is important, and anticipating the benefits. Very, very common for runners to say, I feel really great at the end of it, and just if you just think that through, what a great way of reappraising how the current situation is, to think through how good you're going to feel at the end. Some of the other bits that creep in, the idea of emotion in relation to others, that you get social support from others, comparing yourself to others, drawing inspiration from loved ones, avoiding others, and so what we have is, you can get to see the further ones.
Okay, one of the things about deciding to try and intervene yourself and change your emotions is knowing when to do this. So, Chris, when you've been feeling nervous before a competition, have you...
So we've looked at emotion and emotion regulation in a number of different situations. We looked at it in sport, work, extreme conditions, ultra performance, laboratory, and military. And here's going to be some of the findings. It's going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour across some of these things. And I think I'm only putting them in because it gives a bit of coverage, and some of the people who are going to be listening to this would like to see their name in lights, as it were, and that partly is the case. But there's really some interesting observations about emotions in really unusual situations. So one study we did was with emotions and emotion regulation in novice parachutists. The idea that we had a whole load of parachutists in the military doing their first jump, which seems bizarre that they're going to get nervous, but they did. They get extremely nervous, and so what we have here is their emotions, and what we found was the idea that sport and the intense anxiety that people experience in sport goes some way to prepare people for the types of emotions experienced in their first jump, and the idea that sport has a real function for jobs where that anxiety and managing anxiety is one of the emotions related to common everyday experiences or work-related experiences. A really, really nice study is we did a case study of a female explorer who went to the South Pole and the North Pole. Went to two different studies, and this one is going to focus on the North Pole. And the Tracy Devonport, who did the interviewing and did a tremendous job, and you listen to the interviews of her comments, they are really, really powerful stuff, and you get the idea of someone coping with enormous pressure but doing so in a really, really controlled way. And it's I've listened to those several times for my own emotion regulation strategies because they are so powerful. So what do we have? A female explorer. She did take part in a previous study led by Charlie Pedler and Juliet Lloyd. Her North Pole expedition lasted 84 days. She covered 525 kilometres. These are the fluctuations in her emotions, and what we get is that vigour and fatigue, not too surprisingly, varied considerably, with the idea that nearer the end she's feeling more fatigued. Anger and tension yo-yo up and down, usually as a function of something going on in the environment to make you feel angry or make you feel tense. And there's depression and confusion also changing quite rapidly. Let's look at the strategies that are being used, and we'll have the summary at the top and then read the quote below it. And this was a really interesting one, the idea of anticipating the extreme cold and developing a sense that you've coped with this before, and therefore you can cope with it again. The idea that you have to care for yourself like a dear friend. I mean, she had frostbite, and her description of the frostbite and the idea that you like to lose toes was very powerful. And she talked about the toes as being friends and caring for them, and which obviously had a larger effect on her whole sense of her overall mental state, not just the treatment of her feet, because it gave the idea of acting in a very caring way seemed to have a very positive effect. The idea of speaking to partners, and very importantly the idea of not to slip into a victim mentality, and the idea of into blaming the others, of moaning about when things are not going well. I mean, really strategic and functional in terms of the idea that yes, I'm very, very cold, yes, I'm very, very tired, yes, I'm angry because there's lots of things that have gone wrong, but what I can't do right now at this point is vent this anger. I'm going to have to hold this anger in and let this go out later on when I've got my tent made, because right now I need to put the tent up, I need to light the fire. There's lots of jobs which meant the whole of your attention cannot be taken over by this invasion of emotions that are going on, and real determination to push the emotions to the back of your mind, to concentrate on what matters in order to survive in this case. So we get that in the summary: the proactive effort to engage in strategies to enhance own emotions, conscious rationalization of potentially negative effects of using strategies to worsen emotions, avoiding the victim mentality mindset. Let's get on to some intervention work that we've done. And here we are, emotion regulation in running, and we're looking at self-help interventions, a real precursor to the BBC study, and it gave us an enormous learning curve took place here about developing the sort of online programs, the feedback necessary, and to be really slick in terms of what's required. And the BBC facilitated all of that in the fabulous project that we've run together. Or they run the technology, and we didn't have the technological help, but a lot of people contributed to this, and we spent one Christmas processing runners' data with Tracy, Helen, and Kat. Huge amount of feedback to 300 or so runners, providing them detailed feedback. And we took a risk when we started this project, not knowing how many people would sign up. 1100 or so signed up for the first questionnaire, 300 or so went through the project and got feedback, and that was an enormous amount, a lot more than what we thought. So we helped in order to provide timely feedback. We recruited a whole load of people to do that, and partly why that differs to the BBC is that we learn from those experiences. So I've already alluded to some of these 1100 runners. They completed a whole range of different tests. They were really spread out in who they were. What they had to do was sign up for a 3-stage study. One set a goal to run a certain different distance, distance might be I'm going to run a 2-mile run of their own choice in a certain time, and they told us what the course was, told us what the time was, told us how difficult it was, described the weather conditions. We tried to control for as many things as possible. They then try to achieve that goal in stage 2, reporting all their emotions, their strategies to regulate their emotions, and then in between stages 2 and stage 3, where stage 3 was a repeat of stage 2, we gave them one of 5 interventions. Those interventions were self-selected music, and we've already talked about the fact that we had a basis position or expert statement on music, led by Kostas Karageorgis, the guru on music in sport and exercise. And we asked people to self-select their own music, giving them the Brunel music rating inventory. In other words, giving them a tool in order to go through their playlist to select motivating music. In other words, encouraging them to be able to be systematic and clever in their approach to selecting music. We then gave them music which was written by the company Audiofuel, which as a pacing strategy. We then had if-then planning, which is a fabulous technique which Tom Webb and Pascal Sheeran introduced to me, which is such a simple approach to use but very, very effective across multiple different domains. We'll look at some of those in a moment. Goal setting, which was the idea of intentionally trying to change your emotions by setting a plan to change your emotions. And then self-regulation, which was really the control condition, but because these are all athletes, we'd already asked them what they did to control their emotions. They already said they did stuff, and all we did to them is to say carry on doing the same, because trying to stop them would have made them more conscious of what they were doing anyway, and it would have been really messy type of control condition, because by telling them, we would have had a rebound effect that they'd have thought, well, I've just been made aware that I do imagery more often than I have done previously, so how are you going to stop people drifting into imagery? Very, very difficult. This is Here we see the if-then planning part. So this is how this works. The idea that if I feel gloomy, then I say to myself, you put a then approach to then part to it. And the if-then planning works by if being a barrier to performance. So I identify whatever those barriers are. And this is set in the context of emotion regulation. So the if part is a barrier. So if I feel gloomy, if I feel anxious, if I feel sluggish, and that kicks in, the person suddenly realises they're feeling gloomy, then they want something to stop them feeling gloomy, and so then we gave them a solution to do that. We developed these if-then plans from looking at runners, from blogs on Runner's World, where we looked at how people described what they did to improve their performance, and we constructed these if-then plans. There were lots of them. There's just a couple as an example of some of the options, and people had to pick two. And so they'd have, if I feel anxious, then I tell myself to relax, or if I feel anxious, then I tell myself take another step. I'll always answer yes to that question. The idea that they have an if-then plan. They said that to themselves 2 times. So if-then planning is not meant to be a psychological technique that requires an enormous amount of preparation and planning, but one that is embedded deep into the psyche of someone, that kicks in when the barrier is presented. And here we go, we've gone all jiggy on ourselves. Emotion goal setting, same information as if-then planning, but done in a different way. So I plan to focus on the rhythm of my running. Well, this was one of our then options. I plan to think about the positive characteristics, another one of our then options, and so on. But the idea is that these were plans that people have, and the previous research on if-then planning had contrasted these if-then plans with goal setting to demonstrate that it was more effective. So we in essence did the same type of thing, but made it focused on emotions, but also we brought in other interventions such as music and psychological skills, which are control conditions. What we have here are items from the test of performance strategies, just tweaked for running a bit. So where it's got training or competition or sport, we've put run in, and it makes a little difference to what how the things are interpreted, but it makes an enormous difference to runners who feel that they've got a questionnaire that actually relates to them, not something in a sort of which relates to them. Yeah. So these are our results, and what we found is that people felt an increase in pleasant emotions, felt calmer, felt more energetic, felt happier, and a reduction in the unpleasant emotions post-test, feeling less angry, less anxious, downhearted, and less sluggish. But, and there's a bit of a disappointing but, there's no difference for any one of the interventions. One intervention didn't change any of these emotions any better than any of the others. They all seem to follow this model of the results. What we did find is from our background questionnaires, is that those people who believe that emotions influence performance tended to get more out of the intervention. So right at the very start of the study, if someone believed that emotions had a very powerful effect on performance, the intervention seemed to work better for them, which is a really interesting observation, and it's one that suggests that if someone is ready to receive an intervention that around a variable which they believe really important, they're likely to gain the most out from that. And so that was a really interesting finding. And those people were distributed evenly across the different interventions, and so therefore that would partly explain why one intervention didn't work any more than the other. But that's a really helpful thing that they were distributed evenly, because it'd be a really incorrect observation to make, because if you assume that it's one intervention over the other, but there's an underlying belief that explains it, then you misrepresent what the true differences are. We think that's the best explanation for those, is to do with the fact that some people have a greater susceptibility or a greater readiness for change than others. The key finding from the research is that taking part in the interventions led to improved performance and improved emotional control. So the current project with the BBC is Can You Compete, and we're currently analysing the data. We've picked up some of the same interventions: if then planning, self-talk and visualisation. There are variations of that, and Michael delivers the intervention, which creates a lovely standardised effect and a really powerful persuasive message, because you're totally convinced that you're doing the right thing from Michael. But there's one of them. There is obviously a control condition, and the one of them should work better than others. So where we are so far: identify emotion with best performance. Yeah, we've already talked about it. Identify strategies that help you get to this ideal state. Yeah, that makes sense. Explore what you do, what works for you. That makes sense. Maybe develop an if-then plan if that's appropriate for you. They're so simple, it makes immediate sense to do that. Identify the barriers, put a solution to it. That's something I think is a really helpful strategy, and something that we've recommended on the London Marathon website. Use those strategies, but we put a but there. Why have we put a but there? Is it not? I don't know. It's not that I don't know my slide, but there is a good reason for a but there. And the but is because of some fabulous work by Roy Baumeister. I alluded to earlier that his work was really important. That self-control is fundamental for performance. And the idea, and with it, is that self-control, of which emotional control is part of, uses resources such as glucose, and they have done some absolutely fabulous research which demonstrates this to be the case. And in our Eros project, Karen Niven and Peter Totterdell did some lovely work which looked at emotion regulation being a form of self-control, and argued that people who are better at emotion regulation got the same for less. They use fewer resources. And the idea that what Baumeister was saying is that you deplete your resources, you eat them up, and therefore you are not so good at emotional control, is really fundamental, because it suggests that, here it is, this is the example, that if you have to engage in additional self-control, you will use glucose. So the controlling attention task here, as a result of the people in that group used more glucose. Does that make any sense? It makes perfect sense in sport. It's really important in sport, because if emotion regulation is an effortful process and uses glucose and other physiological factors, then it's using the same physiological resources that are required for performance in sport. So we started exploring this to see if this was the case. And what we started with was some old data. It wasn't old data, collected by Greg White and Rob Shave for one purpose. And we had a whole load of data from people riding for long periods of time in control groups and various different conditions, and put that data together as best I could, in line with put that data together. And what we found is when we looked at people who experience unpleasant emotions, they seem to work a bit harder. And the idea here is a very, very, very tentative explanation, is that it's possible that they were working harder because the unpleasant emotions were being regulated, and there were efforts being made to regulate these unpleasant emotions, and they were contributing to the overall costs of what someone was doing. So the idea that if you have to exercise and you had to experience unpleasant emotions and you had to regulate those unpleasant emotions, then there'd be a cost to that, and that's noticeable in some physiological variable. And in this case, we've got increased ventilation. So what we did in this study is we took a group of 7 cyclists, and each one of those cyclists did 4 10-mile time trials.
Anxious.
Absolute
3
agony.
calm.
We all did this.
2 energetic. 4 sluggish. 2 angry.
Full
5 guilty.
2nd,
downhearted.
had no
2
feedback,
effort.
blinded absolutely everything. The next Two, where we gave
How much
positive
evidence
feedback.
change
None.
feeling? None. One.
Tell them they're going
Confident. How
5%
confident can you
faster
change
than
it?
they actually go.
Good lad.
Or negative feedback. We lied to them again, telling them that they're going slower than they actually were. I mean, the idea is that in the positive feedback condition,
Guilty.
the person would experience
Downhearted.
fewer unpleasant
How much
emotions
effort does it change your
for achieving
feelings?
their goal and
How confident are you
therefore
can change
not
your
had to
feelings?
regulate the
Good
unpleasant
lad.
emotions that might come with having to
9.76 miles.
have to come with such difficulties. So maybe something in the full feedback condition rather angry, and I hope we didn't hear that where he had a face mask over as he swore. So what we found, there were no differences in power output between the negative and positive condition. We're just going to focus on those for the results because they're the most interesting, and it just helps illustrate the points rather than having graphs with 4 things on them. They felt happier when going faster. Well, that's not too surprising, is it? They felt more energetic when going faster, and that's also not too surprising either because they think they're achieving their goals about to perform a lot faster than they're expecting to. They feel more downhearted when they're told they're going slower. That makes sense. They feel more anxious when they're told they're going slower. No difference in heart rate or lactate scores, but just to make a note that look at lactate scores around 10, 8, 9 over the course of after 4 or 5 miles, just to give an indication of just how hard these athletes worked, and the motivation they took part was really fabulous. I know in sports groups we see this all the time in our testing. In general psychology and social psychology, that sort of commitment is absolutely fabulous to someone to really bury themselves for the purpose of your study. They felt more confident, and they felt more confident that they could regulate their emotions when they were being told that they're going faster, and emotion regulation was easier when they were going faster. Some of the physiological differences appeared that they had a lower oxygen usage when told to going faster, with the idea that, it's a strange one in many senses, but the idea that at a lower oxygen usage when you're told to going faster, you could move up to that higher level simply. You've got headroom to move up. Certainly, we know that they've got the capacity to move up to that because they demonstrate. This is against their own performances. And a really remarkable finding: the greater availability of glucose when going fast. The idea that glucose was being depleted, reduced, is the argument from Galileo and Baumeister. And that makes sense. Of course, it makes sense. And in the studies that they were talking about, in this case, when they're doing very hard exercise, those people in the positive feedback were getting glucose launched into the system. That's going over time. Glucose scores were going up, not going down. And the idea that there's not been resources being used, but positive feedback, positive emotions makes greater availability of energy. Really interesting finding. What Matt Wilson did, and he led a group unpacking the bike data to try and explain what was going on. Really weren't convinced that there's no performance differences, and we want to really understand that. So when we had negative feedback, what we've got is a very, very inconsistent pattern of cycling. Big, huge, great pushes to try and get yourself back on track, and that inefficiency of pushing really hard and then being really tired to recover, then really hard and really tired. It's a bit like doing interval running where you sprint for 50 meters and walk for 50 meters, sprint for 50 meters or walk for 50 meters, and you'll go the same speed as if you just jogged along quite slowly. So we've got the positive feedback on the bottom. We've got this much smoother spikes in power, and the little increases we think are when we did some testing. Probably that's when the lactate was being tested. So there were our conclusions. So that's a negative feedback, so with unpleasant emotions, lower VO2 and lower blood glucose. In other words, the attempts to regulate emotions might have resulted in an uneven pacing strategy. So, if performance is not meeting expectations and unpleasant emotions are activated, the point here is be mindful about how you react to those emotions. And here we have possibly emotions activating as information, the people trying to make up the time lost and really pushing really hard to try and overcome those, with the consequence that it backfires in terms of how hard that feels. With these counter strategy would be to try and exercise more smoothly. So what Chris Beattie did in a real act of genius, I think, so he developed his own model for looking at a revised model of emotion regulation. We haven't really tested this, and I just put it in here very briefly, not to try and explain it. I want to make no attempt to explain it, but the idea that what emotions do is help free energy so that and they help free energy so that you can meet the requirements of task demands. And what emotions can do, positive emotions can help the availability of blood glucose. And we're currently testing that in our studies at the moment. There's Chris Fullerton there riding one of the exercise bikes we've got on courses, and we'll be doing studies which look at trying to regulate your emotions across some of those bike-related courses over the next few months and years, possibly. Because, let's face it, Baumeister's been doing this for a long period of time, and we're not going to get anywhere near that immediately. So the message is clear. Identify emotions associated with best performance. Identify strategies to help you get close to that ideal state. Use those strategies, but sometimes it's better just to let those emotions pass. with the idea that fighting the emotions, in the case of our cyclists, led to counterproductive performance in terms of the long-term sustainability of that charge strategy, because eventually we believe that they would have fatigued at a rate much earlier than the cyclists who had positive feedback. So let's finish section 3, look at how we regulate others' emotions, and we'll look at some fabulous work which we're really fortunate to be involved with. The Ride Across America study, which, as we can see, we have some of the athletes, but this is Greg White, as a colleague of mine. He's also a participant in this study, and I'd say I've been a participant in some of Greg's studies, and believe you me, they are painful. Oh, they are painful. But here we have Greg White, Matt Wilson being participants, and they took a battery of physiological tests during this study. They rigged themselves up as they rode across America for a week, and it's a really amazing experience. As I tracked them across the internet, I couldn't go, unfortunately. Track them across the internet and you just see where they're going, and think that across my normal week I'd spend a couple of hours doing one task. Matt and Greg and the guys were just cycling. So what are you doing today? Cycling. So here's some pictures. So we did the normal stuff, what I've talked about earlier, identified the emotions associated with best and worst performance, and what we've got is cyclists 1 and 3 have a very similar emotional profile of best performance. Optimal functional is that it's about feeling happy, it's about feeling energetic. Cyclist 2 is about feeling cyclist 2 is a very different emotional state than the other two. And then we look at the percentage of time when they're experiencing their functional dysfunctional state. Very, very positive on the first day, very dysfunctional on the second day, a switching effect thereafter in terms of the proportion of time in either state. In other words, started very high and switches massively, and that'll be the effect of fatigue and the effect of sleep, and that's documented very nicely in some of the studies. I interviewed one of the riders post-event, and here's some of the experiences we've got and the emotions we've got riding. And what we've got here is this lovely description of very pleasant emotions doing something very, very dangerous, which just characterises the search for excitement this person has, and just how different how situations are in terms of the emotions that they generate. That's not for me, but it's magic for him. When we look at what the challenges for emotions are, they were not to do with the cycling, they were not to do with the fatigue, they were not to do with the course, they were to do with interpersonal emotion regulation strategies. They were to do with mismatches, to do with getting the food wrong. They were to do with comments from various different people, which are not done intentionally to wind someone up. It's a misinterpretation. And there were strategies which were done by people to try and make them feel better, which backfired massively because the receiver was not in any shape or form to take that information on board. And if you are providing support for someone in that situation, sometimes saying less is more. Sometimes allowing them to regulate their own emotions rather than trying to cheer them up can be much better than trying to cheer them up and antagonizing them. Sometimes reading when it's better to let them pass, and there isn't a science to that. That's really an art, but it's also it's something that needs to be considered. The implications we got from this is the mismatch between the optimal emotions and the intended emotional change from the crew really needed some extra work on. And one of the ways to do that would be to look at management of fatigue, and really having a sleep strategy for the support crew so that they could be not so tired when they're engaging with people all the time. And that's really simple to say that, but it is something that you consciously identify as something that's possible, an area to target in order to have a long-term effect on the emotions in that situation, because we saw it switch from day 1 to day 2, and it's gone immediately once the fatigue deprivation starts to kick in. Very briefly, very finally, we'll look at a case study with a same-sex couple. What we've got from this is the idea when we look at the self versus others rating of pleasant and unpleasant emotions, that they both rate themselves in a very pleasant emotional state. They both rate their partners in a much higher emotional state than their own. Their partner's in a better mood than they are. That's an interesting observation. When they talk about strategies, the partner one was very much about engaging in strategies to improve her own emotion. Partner one was very much into engaging strategies to improve her partner's emotions. Partner two did far fewer of these. And on the first look of this, and first way we started analysing the data, it goes, well, that's partner one is great. She's the one, she's engaging lots of strategies to cheer partner two up, and that is where the functionality of this of how these two can overcome the stress of trying to cope with having a baby together. What we found out that over time that it worked really helpfully. So in scenario one, partner one seeks to sustain her own pleasant emotions, but tries to generate her partner's pleasant emotions. So in other words, detecting that partner two is feeling down, tries to cheer them up, and partner one is very good at that, and that's what her strategy said from the profiling. Partner two in the same situation tries to improve her own emotions, so they're both working towards the same goal, and that would be characteristic of how they're working, how their profiles work. Scenario two, partner one seeks to sustain her own emotions and also tries to improve her partner's emotions. Remember, when partner one is upregulating her emotions, partner two is in a good mood. So partner one is keeping them both in a good mood, or doing strategies that will promote keeping them both in a good mood. Remember that partner two tends not to use emotion regulation strategies when she's in a good mood. So partner one here is keeping the good mood going. Partner situation three, partner two seeks to upregulate partner one's pleasant emotions. Partner two identifying partner one's not in a good mood, engage in strategies. And remember, partner two underestimates the pleasant mood, so we'll begin this process really early. Remember, partner one keeps the good mood going, so keeping partner one in a good mood is really functional. Scenario 4, both of them are in an unpleasant mood. Partner 2 seeks to upregulate both partners' emotions, and which has the function of trying to get partner 1 in a good mood, and accordingly when partner 1 is in a good mood, partner 1 then seeks to sustain the good moods of partner 2. Remember, the mean data at the start would say that they were in a good mood most of the time, so that would mean that partner 1 was probably in full mode of keeping the good mood going, and to the observer that could be seen as the case. Partner 1 is this lively, chatty person. That is helped hugely by our data here, which suggests that partner 2 picks the negative mood up and keeps it accordingly. If they were both like partner 1, they'd get to a negative mood. There'd be a tendency to stick there, and that's how the interplay between the emotions and emotion regulation strategies, and detecting when the other person requires a change in emotion, how that works so nicely. So we're coming to the end. We've had some really interesting case studies. We've helped Christine Bleakley. I was called up by Greg a couple of days before she was going to do the channel crossing on water skis, just to try and help her. Emotion regulation for me really is probably worth talking about, is that you're going to be filmed, and if it goes wrong, you could easily be the person who is blamed. And that's not to say that going wrong for me is far less dramatic than going wrong for Christine, who had to be dragged across the English Channel, which is grim, and the sea is cold, and the arms do hurt. But it was quite, in terms of just to put my own experiences at the front here, it was quite a challenge in terms of your own emotion regulation to try and explain strategies to manage unwanted emotions, while at the same time you're actually experiencing some yourself. So I think that's a really interesting thing about going to do any of the work in sports psychology, is that you often get quite nervous about going into new situations, meeting new people, particularly where people expect you to work magic really quickly, and I'm not sure of anything. I am not the Paul Daniels, who is a magician of sports psychology and instant fix, and most of what I'm suggesting is about applying science rather than applying a sort of guru type approach. Anyway, we gave Christine if-then plans. It's the simplicity of the if-then plan, and the idea that we worked in strategies to try and focus on relaxing muscles, relaxing the biceps, which if you get really tense biceps, you really can be counterproductive to performance. Challenging stuff, and there are lots of others interesting case studies which have been unpacked in this EROS project over the last 5 years, which I could talk about. I didn't really have time to do that just today. And in summary, identify and assess current and desired emotional states. I think it's absolutely vital that you do that, so you know where you're at in terms of your emotional profile of what you are feeling and where you'd like to go. Identify strategies that you can use. Do you like to change what you're thinking? Do you like to, if you're an athlete and you want to get yourself in a good mood, maybe a long warm-up is what you need. If you believe that long warm-up is what you need in terms of lots of jogging, then probably is the case that it would work. Building that into a structure so that 30 minutes before your competition you can engage in this is exactly what you need to be doing. You've suddenly got control over you've certainly got a strategy that can help you get control over your emotions. Be aware of the consequences of engaging in emotion regulation strategies on yourself and others, and the idea that they can eat away at resources, or what you intend to do backfires, as in the case of some of the stuff on the ride across America. And that's just been really aware of what's going on, and developing all sorts of monitoring systems if you're interested in revising your own strategies. And also sometimes strategies to change your own emotions can change the emotions of others. So you might cheer yourself up and have the consequence of cheering others up, and you won't be aware that what's going on necessarily, but it's not sometimes not a bad idea to take that risk to cheer yourself up, and others can watch you cheering yourself up and catch that emotions accordingly. Oh, thank you very much. There's lots of links, all this. Oh, thank you. There's lots of links going on within this presentation. You can get them all available, but basically this presentation allows you to access lots and lots of work. So when you've got the slides, click them up and they'll be in the YouTube clip at the bottom end of this presentation. In the basis presentation there'll be questions. Many thanks for people for listening. Anyone who has listened to this, I know everyone in my house has gone out while I've been recording this because they've heard me witter on a lot about this previously, and what we've got and what I know about now is that I am way over the top for the basis one, and that will not be an hour and 20 minutes. So a lot of the section, this will be the long version, there'll be a short version to come.